This is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You're listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today we're speaking with Madeline Miller. Madeline has a master's degree in the classics from Brown University and has previously been a Latin and Greek teacher. She is most famous, however, as the author of the best-selling books Circe and Songs of Achilles. Before we begin, a quick thank you to our Classical Wisdom members who make this podcast possible. If you wish to become a member and support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.com and click Start Here. So I really enjoyed your book, and I know you have lots and lots of fans, and for those who haven't read Circe, just as sort of a very brief synopsis, it's sort of the story of the witch that you find in the Odyssey, but told from her perspective. And this kind of tactic of telling the perspectives from the villain's view, or retelling kind of an old story from a new perspective, often the baddie, is obviously not a new tactic. As I told you before, I'm based in Buenos Aires, so anybody who's a Borges fan might remember the House of Astrion, told from the Minotaur's perspective. But why did you choose, of all of the characters in the ancient world, why Circe? Why did she sort of deserve a fresh look?
She was this character that I had been really drawn to for a really long time, since I was a child. And I think I liked a number of things about her. I really appreciated her witchcraft. That part of what draws me to her power is the fact that witchcraft doesn't come like most divine power. It's not the sort of snap your fingers and suddenly something happens. Witchcraft is much closer to the creative art. It's something that takes time and effort and skill and knowledge. And so all of that, was very appealing to me. I basically saw her as an artist. I also like the fact that she's born into the society where she has very little power, this incredibly patriarchal society that is hostile to female independence, and yet she manages to somehow, through her witchcraft, create her own power, create a life for herself with some independence and some ability to have agency over her own life. I also was drawn to her character because I thought she was really unfairly portrayed. First of all, in Homer, where she immediately has to kind of fold to Odysseus. But actually, even more than in Homer, in later versions after Homer, because usually she does get remembered as a villain in kind of later portraits of her. But she's actually not a villain in Homer. She's frightening. She turns men into pigs. But she also is one of the most helpful characters that Odysseus encounters in the whole Odyssey. And so I sort of felt like this was an example of, yes, I wanted to reclaim sort of a character that's often treated as a villain, but actually I don't think she really is a villain in the earliest versions of her story. And so it was sort of a double wanting to reach back. And I'm always interested in the psychological sort of inner workings of each of my characters. And so one of the big psychological questions that I was really intrigued by with Circe is, why is she turning men into pigs? That is not answered in the Odyssey at all. No one even asks her. And so it sort of seemed like this huge mystery was there. There was this really powerful, interesting woman, and this mystery and this history of her being both misunderstood and kind of flattened as a character. So those things were all irresistible to me.
So it's interesting what you just mentioned, that in Homer, she's not really that much of a bad guy. I mean, yeah, it's not nice to turn men into pigs, but there's obviously much worse things you could do, and characters do. So why did she evolve from the sort of specific details of Homer to being this predatory female? And I know, like, even in the classical time period, but then, like you said, especially in the Renaissance, she becomes like this trope of like the wanton woman, and the sort of evil seductress. Why did that happen, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think it's the classic fear that we have had in our society for millennia, of women with power, and particularly women who have power over men. I mean, that's really what the word witch is. If you look at witch kind of across all the different versions, what witch really means is it's a word that we use for a woman who has an amount of power that is frightening, or that is somehow uncontrolled by the people around her. And so I think that it was just fear. She became this sort of embodiment of male anxiety about female power. And so therefore she had to be treated as a villain, because you don't want women thinking that they can just get away with doing something to men, and then being treated as something positive. So she had to be sort of culturally punished, I feel like, in order to keep women in their place. But one of the things that's most interesting, I think, about that portrait of her in Homer is the fact that it's actually told by Odysseus. It's one of the sections of the Odyssey that Odysseus himself narrates. And so not only are we dealing with kind of the, Homeric cultural view of women, but we're dealing with the fact that, like, the ancient literature is telling us this story. And so I feel like now there's a lot of freedom to question and push back and say, okay, Odysseus, that's how you claimed it went. Of course you want to emphasize how terrifying she was, and then you want to emphasize how how sexy she was and how impressive she was, because that makes you look good. But where's the real woman in this? Where is the woman in her own life, not the woman who's being used as this is sort of a paraphrase of a line from Margaret Atwood, who's being used as a stick to beat other women, which I think is what is the villainous Circe. So it's very interesting how often that happens to women with power, that they get turned into villains.
I gotta say, I do love this sort of trend at the moment where we're kind of re-examining characters, and both historical and fictional, from the ancient world, and taking our sort of modern perspectives on them. And it kind of made me think of other ways that we can, I guess, understand and appreciate the classics from our modern world. So, for instance, when I think of the age of heroes, it's sort of men and gods communicating with each other very directly, and that's not something we really do anymore. I mean, if somebody does say they're communicating with gods, they usually get locked up and given some extreme medication. So it's something that's a little bit less relatable to us. So I was curious if this was a theme that you see in mythology, or one that you sort of put in the book, or maybe I'm just totally making stuff up and theorizing out loud here, but that there's sort of maybe a class element as well, between sort of the gods and the heroes and the mortals. Like you said, that one of the things you liked about Circe is that, she worked hard, and that made me think of like serfs or something, having to toil the land, versus like the aristocracy, where they just are given all of their wealth and powers and beauty, and they don't have to work for it. They don't appreciate it.
So I really, that is definitely something that I think is there. And I think the ancients even, that I would argue that Virgil's Aeneid, that the gods are very much stand for the political elite, people who had so much power that they were basically like gods. And so I think you can absolutely see that, and this is where I see so many resonances. I mean, the ancients had a saying, nothing new under the sun. And I think that is pretty much right. And I think we are struggling right now with, a time period where the people who have the most amount of wealth and power have so much money that it is kind of like our gods. They're almost completely, isolated from any sort of consequence or from anything, ever going wrong. And one of the things, so I think it's interesting that very strong class structure does exist, that the gods are basically these all-powerful beings who have, unlimited resources and power that just comes to them from inheritance. They're born with it. But it's not good for them. That's what I think is really interesting, is that the Greek gods are really monstrous compared to humans. That humans are much more admirable than gods in the ancient material. And in fact, when Achilles is acting at his most vicious and brutal and vengeful and bloodthirsty, he's said to be acting like a god. And so that's really interesting to me that, and this is something that actually modern psychology has shown, that the more power and privilege you have, unless you actively work against it, and it is possible to work against it if you're aware, sympathy starts going down. And I feel like the ancients understood that intuitively. They understood that it's not good for humans to become so disconnected from our empathy to other humans. And so I very much think that the gods can be read as a metaphor, or at least as kind of an echo of that.
Yeah, if only more people were sort of aware of that. I mean, we live in a society today, I think, that everyone sort of pushes the main goal is to be the most beautiful, the most rich, the most famous, the most successful, but that very few people question if that will actually make them happy or moral. And I wonder if in the ancient world, because that level of success was, quarantined or maybe confined to like deity, people might not have aimed for it. And nowadays we're like, well, yeah, sure, I can be Kim Kardashian if I just get enough followers on Instagram or something. Because we don't realize that we shouldn't even try for that, or that it's so beyond our reach. I don't know, maybe that makes us less happy.
Exactly. And I think, and that I think other psychologists on that, which is that, beyond, once you sort of meet a basic level of need and safety, and, once a person has enough food and safety and shelter, anything above that doesn't actually increase their happiness, and indeed may decreases their distance from other people.
Yeah, it's
so this is all my background in psychology, which I find human psychology so interesting and engaging. I don't have a degree in it because my school didn't have minors, but I would have had a minor if my school did, and I loved digging into sort of the ways that these ancient works, although, they don't have the same words for psychological things that we do today, things like PTSD are absolutely visible in the ancient literature. And I think it's always interesting to me to see how humans are still struggling with a lot of these same kind of big questions.
Well, I think your interest in psychology really shows in your characters, because they're so vivid, and they're so, you see their motivations, their reactions. I think that really brings them to life. And, I gotta say, it must be one of the things that for people who study the classics absolutely loves, because you get to run into all these characters that you have always read about, and make them, they seem so alive. And I think, in a weird way, it must be comparable to how the ancients felt, when they got to chapter 10 in the Odyssey, and, Odysseus is in the underworld, and he runs into all these, the who's who of the ancient Greek mythology, and the readers would have been like, oh yeah, look, here's here's Ajax, and here's Achilles, and oh great, we get to see them again. And so for modern readers, that's how it feels like when you're like, oh look, here's Jason and Medea when you're reading Circe. It's quite a lot of fun. But I was wondering, the characters are so real. Like, how did you do your research? Like, what kind of resources were you able to kind of use to bring these characters just so alive?
So I try and kind of look at all the ancient portraits or references to the various characters, and I don't. I'm very grateful for my academic background in classics, but I also have come to realize that I have to trust my novelist's sensibilities. So I sort of use that academic research, but then I don't. I kind of sift through it a little bit like a magpie. What are the shiny things, the things that are catching my attention, and then my imagination kind of starts to work on those things. So I don't try and be exhaustive for the most part with characters. So we don't use absolutely every myth about Circe out there. First of all, many of them are contradictory.
Yeah.
But I also, it's important for me to just sort of follow, well, what is the story I'm interested in telling? What are the pieces that make sense to me? With Odysseus, part of what I wanted to do is bring in a bunch of myths about him that are not in the Odyssey. I think people have a artificially positive view of Odysseus from the Odyssey. So I would say that the Odyssey is probably the most positive portrait of Odysseus from the ancient world, and it's still, as you know, not that positive. Whereas in a lot of the tragedies or in the Iliad, he's much more openly villainous. And everyone sort of acknowledges that, that he's ruthless and unscrupulous, and he'll definitely stab you in the back. And so I wanted to bring in some of these other myths about Odysseus, and it's been really fun to have readers say to me, why do you hate Odysseus? And it's like, I don't hate him. Those are all myths about him that exist. Most of them are from the Iliad, but they don't reflect quite so well on him. So I have always seen Odysseus as a very complicated character. And, it's one of the things that interests me about him is this idea of honor. So one of the things he does in the Iliad is he kills a bunch of sleeping, unarmed Trojan allies. Mm-hmm. It's the type of thing that you could never imagine Achilles or Ajax doing unless Achilles was in his rage once Patroclus is killed. So it's a very dishonorable thing to do. On the other hand, it's a type of thing that wins wars. And ultimately, that's what Odysseus is trying to do. He's trying to win the war and end the war and go home. And so, it's very pragmatic. On the other hand, if the war drags on forever, then you're going to be losing more life that way. So I wanted his pragmatism to be kind of front load. I'm very interested in his pragmatism and how that pragmatism can sometimes become cruel, but how it's this core identity thing for him. So I really just, through all the material, gathered everything I could find, and then let sort of the muse, the inspiration, my connection to the material guide me as to what pieces to use and what not.
I liked, by the way, how you said a complicated man, because it made me think of the first line of the Odyssey as translated by Emily Wilson, let me tell you a story of a complicated man. And it is interesting because, I've read interviews from her too, where she was saying like, if I wanted to, I could tell you this is a story of a wayfaring husband or an unfaithful husband. It is interesting how when we translate, even now, different translations, just how different we can portray these characters and just completely alter the narrative about the entire purpose of the Odyssey, just from the first line.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm so glad you brought up Emily Wilson, because I think her translation is brilliant. I think she's brilliant. And I think her translation should be standard reading for all people reading the Odyssey. But on top of it, I love her introduction for just that reason, because what she does is she says, there's this sort of been this veneer that some translators use of being objective. And she says, all translation is interpretation. I am definitely having to make interpretive choices as I go through the poem. And I love that she's very upfront about that. And she's talking about how she is trying to use those interpretations very deliberately to try and sort of highlight things in the text, one of which is, as she eloquently talks about, the women that Odysseus orders killed at the end of the Odyssey, which traditionally the word for them has been translated as maids, the maids. And the word in Greek is female slave. And that's just a very different feel for us reading it as a modern audience. A maid implies someone who maybe gets paid and home at night and possibly has some choice of where they work, as opposed to someone who is being owned as property, has no consent, no ability to refuse or accept, really. And so I think she very eloquently talks about how important it is to be thoughtful about the way we are choosing those interpretations.
Well, especially because, he kills them because they've slept with the suitors. And, of course, if you just make it sound like they had any agency in that, then it makes it almost, well, not justifies, obviously, but at least explains why he's done it. But if they're slaves and they've obviously just been raped, then, I don't know, it doesn't seem to make any sense that they get murdered for that. And I think even in some translations, to make Odysseus seem less cruel, they're even suggested to being promiscuous. To really even justify Odysseus.
Exactly, as opposed, right. As if it's okay to kill a promiscuous woman. So, that has its own problem. But exactly as you say, these women were enslaved. This was rape. Any sexual relationship that they had with the suitors, they didn't really have the consent to say no. So absolutely, I think it's such a troubling moment in the Odyssey. But even more troubling than that moment is the fact of how I think people who love the Odyssey and love Odysseus have either, through just being misguided or through being, I don't know what the word would be, nefarious, have tried to conceal those problematic aspects.
Yeah, I think it's good of us today to, I like as an exercise to sort of knock people off their pedestals every now and then. But it almost makes me wonder, because we sort of, I don't know if today we like having our heroes just a bit more simple. They have to all be good or idealized. In the ancient world, would they have thought Odysseus was a great guy? Or would they just said, yeah, he's kind of evil also. It's just more interesting. Or did they think that some of the evil aspects of him were totally socially acceptable in that day and age?
Well, I think you're asking a really, really great question. And our idea of heroes today is to be this totally positive figure. And when we say the word hero, we mean someone who is like a moral exemplar. But when we talk about heroes in the ancient Greek context, that's not really what they meant. If anything, I think it's more akin to like Olympic athletes or celebrities. Yeah. That these were flawed, very human people. They had big strengths and they also had weaknesses. Absolutely would have critiqued Odysseus in the ancient world and would have critiqued Achilles in the ancient world. And none of these heroes, I think, were held up as paragons of virtue.
Classical Wisdom members can find the full podcast on classicalwisdom.com. You can also find all of Madeline Miller's books, including Circe and Song of Achilles, on amazon.com. Thank you again for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks.